Welcome, sleepy summoner. Tonight, let yourself rest deeply, for you are about to hear a tale forged among the oldest stones and brightest stars of Runeterra. This is not a flight of dreaming fancy or a legend spun by fans. Every moment you will hear is drawn directly from the stories, truths, and canon revealed by the world crafters at Riot, woven together to help you find gentle comfort and peace as you drift into sleep. Let your body become heavy, your thoughts grow still, and your breath slow as moonlight gathers softly around you. While the world outside quiets, you will travel far through time and realm, meeting beings who shaped an age of hope and sorrow. At the heart of this story stands Zaahen the Unsundered, a being who once soared above Shurima as a guardian eagle, whose nobility shone even as darkness consumed his kind. Zaahen's path runs deep, weighed with sacrifice, honor, and the struggle to resist the world's corruption. Yet Zaahen's fate is never woven alone. As you drift, you will meet Yunara, the loyal guardian whose friendship became the anchor that held a sacred temple steady for countless ages. You will encounter Xinjiao, a mortal warrior with true resolve, who becomes a host and ally to Zaahen at the moment when all balance hangs by a thread. Their destinies entwine through trials of courage, wisdom, and the choice to do what is right when hope seems lost. Other figures move by starlight through this tale. You will glimpse noble ascended of Shurima, whose path leads to both glory and tragedy. You will witness the rise and fall of the Darkin, once heroes twisted by war, now imprisoned in weapons or lurking as ancient threats. LeBlanc, cunning and ever scheming, steps forth as a voice of old plots seeking forbidden power. Atakan, a force of monstrous hunger, threatens to tip all destinies into shadow. Tonight, sleepy summoner, you rest knowing the story you hear stays true to Riot lore, shaped only to help you sleep. Nothing is imagined beyond their own revelations. The world is ready to comfort you and bring peace as you listen. Nestle into your dreams and let Zaahen's saga, woven with courage, friendship, and the strength to choose the light, carry you toward restful sleep. The gates of Runeterra open for you now. The legend of Zaahen is ready to begin. Zaahen the Unsundered, a complete canonical bedtime story. Part 1. The Golden Age. Long before the world learned to fear the darkness that dwelt in the deep places of Runeterra, there existed a realm of extraordinary splendor and celestial majesty. In the scorching sands of Shurima, beneath skies that burned with the fierce brilliance of molten gold, an empire had risen to touch the very heavens themselves. This was not merely a kingdom of mortal men and women, though mortals dwelt within its borders and served its purposes. This was a realm touched by the divine, inhabited by beings whose power transcended the ordinary bounds of the natural world. The Shuriman Empire stood as a beacon of civilization and strength. Its monuments reached toward the sky like prayers made manifest in stone and metal. Its people had learned to harness the arcane forces that flowed through the world, bending them to their will through ritual and discipline. The deserts that surrounded this great realm seemed to bow before its majesty, and even the stars above appeared to shine with greater brilliance over the lands that the Shuriman Empire claimed as its own. At the heart of this empire dwelt a class of beings known as the Ascended. These were not gods in the way that the ancient peoples of other lands conceived of divinity. Rather, they were warriors of supreme skill and virtue, who had been elevated through sacred rites of transformation. When an ascended warrior emerged from these transformative rituals, they became something more than mortal. They transcended the limitations of flesh and time. They became beings of celestial power, neither fully divine nor entirely mortal, but existing in the liminal space between the two. The ascension ceremony was not performed lightly. Only those warriors who had demonstrated exceptional merit, unshakable honor, and supreme capability were deemed worthy of such transformation. The process was carefully guarded, the knowledge of its workings held sacred by the priestly orders and the rulers of Shurima. When a warrior underwent the ascension, their very essence was refined and elevated. Their bodies became infused with divine essence, their minds touched by the infinite wisdom of the cosmos itself. Each ascended warrior emerged with a form suited to their nature and their destiny. Some took shapes that appeared nearly human, while others transformed into creatures of myth and majesty. Some became mighty birds with wings that spanned the width of the entire buildings. Others became felines of terrible beauty or reptiles of ancient power. Regardless of the form they took, all ascended warriors shared certain qualities: immortality, immense strength, and the burden of responsibility that came with such gifts. Among the many ascended warriors who served the Shuriman Empire in its golden age, there stood one whose name would echo through the corridors of history, whose deeds would be remembered by those who loved honor and sacrifice. His name was Zaahen, and he was unlike any other ascended warrior who had come before him or would come after. Zaahen had not always been ascended. There was a time when he walked the sands of Shurima as a mortal warrior, though even in those distant days, he had demonstrated qualities that set him apart from ordinary men. His vision was keener than that of the eagle that soared over the desert. His mind was sharp as the finest blade ever forged in the Shuriman smithies. His heart burned with an unwavering commitment to justice and the protection of those weaker than himself. These qualities, combined with his exceptional martial prowess and unshakable moral character, led the priests and rulers of Shurima to mark him as a candidate for ascension. When Zaahen underwent the sacred transformation, something remarkable occurred. His form became that of a great and terrible eagle, a creature of such majesty and power that all who witnessed it were moved to awe. Yet unlike many of the other ascended, whose ascension sometimes brought with it a measure of arrogance or a hunger for dominion, Zaahen remained fundamentally unchanged in his essential nature. He retained the noble qualities that had defined him as a mortal: his towering intelligence, his capacity for compassion, his commitment to the protection of the innocent, and his deep love of justice remained at the core of his being, even as his physical form became something transcendent. As an ascended warrior, Zaahen served as a guardian and protector. He soared above the deserts of Shurima, his golden wings catching the light of the sun, his great eyes seeing all that transpired below. When enemies threatened the realm, he flew to meet them. When disasters struck, he worked to alleviate suffering. When disputes arose among the ascended warriors themselves, his voice carried tremendous weight and authority, for all recognized the integrity of his judgment and the purity of his intentions. In those ancient days, before the shadows grew long and the corruption began to spread, Zaahen was regarded not merely as a warrior of great skill, but as something more. He was a symbol of what the ascension could represent at its best. he was proof that even the mightiest beings, those wielding power almost beyond mortal comprehension, could choose to use that power in service of others rather than in pursuit of selfish dominion. He was a beacon, a guide, and a reminder that honor and righteousness were not mere luxuries for the weak, but virtues that the strongest could and should embody. The realm over which Zaahen kept watch was vast and complex. Other ascended warriors shared the burden of protecting Shurima. There was Azir, whose form was that of a magnificent bird, and whose talent for leadership had made him a natural choice for positions of great authority. There was Nasus, a being of immense strength and intellect, who had dedicated his immortal life to the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. There were many others, each powerful in their own way, each bringing their unique gifts to the service of the realm. During the long centuries when the Shuriman Empire stood at the height of its power, these ascended warriors worked in relative harmony. Certainly, there were moments of disagreement and periods when tensions ran high between different factions of the Ascended. But by and large, they understood the compact that bound them together. They recognized that their power came with responsibility. They accepted that their role was to serve as guardians and protectors, not as tyrants or despots. Yet the world is not static. All things must change. All golden ages must eventually come to an end, and the seeds of destruction were already growing, even as Zaahen kept his eternal watch over the realm he had sworn to protect. Beneath the sands of Shurima, in places that had been sealed away and forgotten by the people of the Empire, there were caverns and tunnels that reached deep into the earth. In the deepest and most secret of these places, far below the reach of sunlight and the normal awareness of mortal and ascended alike, something waited. This was the void, a force of anti-existence, a hunger that consumed all things and left only emptiness in its wake. The void was not native to Runeterra. It existed in a dimension adjacent to the normal world, separated from it by barriers that had been erected by the ancient powers that had shaped the world in ages past. But these barriers, while strong, were not eternal. They could be worn down. They could be breached. In the city of Ikathia, far from Shurima, yet still part of the sprawling network of kingdoms and city-states that made up the known world, there dwelt scholars and researchers who pursued knowledge above all else. These were brilliant minds, men and women who pushed the boundaries of understanding. Yet in their pursuit of hidden truths and forbidden knowledge, they became reckless. They delved into texts that should have remained sealed. They performed experiments that should have remained untouched. And eventually, in the deepest chambers beneath their great city, they succeeded in tearing open a wound between worlds. The void poured through that wound like a vast and hungry tide. It consumed everything it touched. Buildings fell before it as though they were made of sand. People and creatures alike were unmade, their very essence stripped away by a force that recognized no distinction between life and death, matter and energy, being and non-being. The void was a catastrophe beyond any that the civilized peoples of the world had previously experienced. Word of this terrible event eventually reached Shurima. The ascended warriors, recognizing the grave threat that the void represented, gathered to discuss what must be done. They understood that if the void was left unchecked, it would eventually consume all of Runeterra. It had to be stopped. A military expedition was mounted, the greatest, assembly of ascended warriors and Shuriman soldiers that could be gathered on short notice. Their mission was to travel to Ikathia, to seal the breach that had been torn in reality, and to destroy or banish the void that threatened the world. Zaahen was among those who volunteered for this desperate mission. In fact, many accounts suggest that it was Zaahen who recognized the strategic necessity of what must be done and who helped rally his fellow Ascended to the cause. What followed was a war of such intensity and horror that it would reshape the history of Runeterra forever. Part 2. The War Against the Void. The journey to Ikathia was long and perilous. The delegation of Ascended warriors and their mortal allies travelled across vast distances, making their way through hostile territories and dangerous lands. Zaahen flew at the vanguard of this great company, his keen eyes spotting threats before they could endanger the expedition. His wisdom and strategic thinking helped the group navigate the complex politics of the various kingdoms through whose lands they had to pass. Though the goal was dire and urgent, Zaahen maintained the morale and discipline of those under his watch. He ensured that supplies were gathered, that the wounded were tended to, and that all who marched with him understood the terrible importance of what they were setting out to accomplish. When they finally reached Ikathia, what they found was nightmare made manifest. The city was not dead, but neither was it alive in any sense that could be called normal. The buildings still stood, but they seemed wrong, distorted, as though viewed through water that rippled constantly. The air itself seemed to shimmer and distort, and everywhere one looked, there were signs of the void's influence. Plants that had wilted and withered to nothing. Animals that had been transformed into terrible abominations that bore only a passing resemblance to creatures that had once lived. People who had been partially consumed by the void, yet somehow remained alive, their minds shattered beyond all hope of recovery. The gateway to the void, the wound in reality that had been torn open by the careless experiments of Ikathia scholars, was located deep beneath the city in vast underground chambers. Zaahen and the other Ascended warriors made their way down into those depths, descending through layer after layer of corrupted stone and twisted architecture. The deeper they went, the more pervasive the signs of the void became. The very laws of nature seemed to break down in the deepest chambers. Gravity would shift inexplicably. Time seemed to flow in unusual patterns. The minds of those who ventured too far into the void-touched regions began to fray and crack under the strain. When the Ascended finally reached the breach itself, they found that closing it would not be a simple task. The void was not something that could be killed or defeated through martial prowess alone. It was a force of nature, or rather, a force of anti-nature, a fundamental negation of existence itself. To seal the breach, the Ascended would have to work together to channel their collective power toward creating a barrier that the void could not overcome. This required tremendous concentration, coordination, and the willingness to remain in place while channeling their power, leaving them vulnerable to attack. While the leading group of Ascended warriors worked to seal the breach, another group took on the responsibility of defending them from the void creatures and corrupted beings that defended this terrible threshold. Zaahen placed himself at the forefront of this defensive line. With his glaive held high, his golden wings spread wide, He threw himself at the twisted abominations that emerged from the depths of the void. He fought with both courage and skill, but the experience of facing such creatures, of witnessing the reality-warping and sanity-breaking nature of the void up close, took a terrible toll on his immortal spirit. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, though in mortal terms it lasted only hours. When it was finally over, and the breach had been sealed, the ascended warriors emerged from the depths of Icathia, forever changed. They had succeeded in their mission. The void had been stopped. The immediate threat to Runeterra had been averted. Yet the price had been terrible. Many of those ascended warriors who had ventured into the deepest chambers never fully recovered from what they had witnessed there. The human mind, even an immortal one, was not built to confront the void. Exposure to it left deep scars that no healing magic could fully mend. Some of the ascended began to display signs of tremendous psychological trauma. They became prone to violent outbursts. Their judgment became questionable. Some even became paranoid, suspicious of their own companions, fearing that the void corruption might have claimed them without their knowledge. Yet worse was to come. Some of the ascended warriors, in their desperation to regain a sense of control and power after their encounters with the void, began to pursue forbidden knowledge. They discovered that there were rituals, ancient and terrible, that could grant them even greater power than their ascension had provided. These rituals involved the manipulation of blood and the channeling of dark energies that went against everything that the natural order was meant to permit. Through these forbidden practices, known as blood magic, certain of the ascended began to transform into something else entirely. The Zaahen, as these corrupted ascended warriors came to be known, were no longer the noble protectors that they had once been. They retained their immense strength and their immortal nature, but their minds became twisted and corrupted. They became warlords and despots, tyrants who used their power to dominate and destroy. They turned on one another in terrible conflicts known as the Zaahen Wars. They ravaged the kingdoms of mortals, enslaving or destroying vast populations. Where once these beings had been paragons of virtue, they became monsters of cruelty and ambition. Part 3. The Path of Light. Yet even in this time of terrible darkness, there remained one light that did not falter. That light was Zaahen. Though Zaahen had been present at the confrontation with the void, though he had witnessed the same horrors that had broken so many of his siblings, he resisted the corruption that consumed them. Even as his fellow ascended fell away into madness and darkness, Zaahen clung to the principles that had guided him since the days of his mortality. He refused to pursue blood magic. He rejected the path of domination and tyranny. He continued to see himself as a guardian and protector, even as the world descended into chaos around him. As the Zaahen Wars intensified, Zaahen made a choice that cost him greatly. He could no longer stand by and allow his own kin to wreak destruction upon the innocent peoples of Runeterra. Though it broke his heart, though each battle caused him profound psychological pain, Zaahen took up arms against his own siblings. He became the enemy of those who had once been his companions. He fought to contain and control the destructive power of the Zaahen, working to protect mortal kingdoms from their depredations. It was during this time that Zaahen forged an alliance with one of the greatest mortal warrior leaders that Runeterra had ever produced. Her name was Yunara, and she was a woman of incredible skill, unshakable courage, and a spirit that matched or exceeded that of any immortal warrior. Yunara had dedicated her life to the defense of the lands that she called home. She had seen what the Darkin were doing to her people, and she had made the decision to stand against them, regardless of the personal cost. When Yunara and Zaahen first met, it was not in circumstances of peace. They encountered one another during a desperate battle in which Yunara and her warrior band were fighting to hold back an advancing force of Darkin corrupted soldiers. Zaahen, witnessing this valiant but seemingly futile struggle, made the decision to aid them. He descended from the skies, his golden wings spread wide, and threw himself into the fray alongside Yunara. Together, they fought with such courage and skill that the Darkin forces were driven back. What began as a chance encounter in battle blossomed into a deep and abiding partnership. Yunara recognized in Zaahen a kindred spirit, a being who valued honor and justice above all else. Zaahen, in turn, came to respect Yunara not merely as a warrior, but as a moral exemplar, a mortal woman whose commitment to righteousness exceeded that of many immortals. Though they were of different races and came from different worlds, they found in one another a perfect complement. Where Zaahen brought immortal wisdom and tremendous power, Yunara brought tactical brilliance and the ability to inspire those around her to greater deeds. Alongside Yunara, Zaahen traveled to the First Lands, the sacred realm where the Kinku Order, an ancient spiritual organization dedicated to maintaining balance and harmony, had maintained their most sacred temple and center of power. The First Lands were a place where the line between the material world and the spirit realm grew thin. They were infused with ancient magic and protected by powerful wards that had been established many centuries in the past. At Koshin Peak, the highest point of the First Lands, there stood the hidden temple where the Kinku Order had watched the stars and studied the movements of the cosmos for millennia. It was in this sacred place that Zaahen and Yunara went to seek aid and to rally the remaining forces that might still stand against the tide of Darkin corruption that was threatening to consume all of Runeterra. The leaders of the Kinku Order were not quick to trust the approach of an immortal god warrior, even one who claimed to come as an ally. Centuries of watching the conflicts of the world had made them cautious and skeptical, but Yunara, with her eloquent words and her demonstrated commitment to the cause of justice, succeeded in convincing them that Zaahen was genuine in his desire to aid them. The decision of the Kinku Order to formally ally themselves with Zaahen was symbolized through a sacred ceremony before the Eye of Twilight. The Eye of Twilight was not merely a physical location, though there was indeed a shrine dedicated to it within the temple. It was a cosmic force of judgment, an aspect of the universal consciousness that observed and evaluated the actions of beings of power. When Zaahen and the representatives of the Kinku made their formal alliance before the Eye of Twilight, they were entering into a pact that was sacred and binding, witnessed not by mortal authority alone, but by forces that transcended the mortal realm entirely. With this alliance sealed, Zaahen was able to bring to bear both the considerable magical knowledge that the Kinku possessed and the leadership of Yunara, who worked tirelessly to coordinate the various mortal forces that were standing against the Darkin. For nearly 3 years, this grand coalition fought against the corrupted god warriors and their armies of enslaved followers. The battles were fierce and devastating. Many fell on all sides. Yet through the combination of Zaahen's immortal power, the Kinku Order's arcane knowledge, Yunara's military genius, and the courage of countless mortal warriors, the tide gradually began to turn against the Darkin. One of the crucial breakthroughs in this extended conflict came when Zaahen and the Kinku researchers discovered a method by which the Darkin could be restrained and imprisoned rather than merely defeated in combat. This breakthrough was tremendously important, for it had become clear that the Darkin could not be permanently killed or destroyed. Their immortal nature meant that even when they were defeated in battle, they would eventually recover and return to threaten the world once more. Using the arcane knowledge that the Kinku possessed, and under the leadership and direction of Zaahen, a method was developed whereby each Darkin who was defeated could be bound into a weapon or artifact. The process was complex and required great skill and power to execute, but it proved to be effective. One by one, the rogue god warriors were defeated and imprisoned. Artrox, one of the most powerful and most destructive of the Darkin, was bound into a mighty blade. Varus was imprisoned within a great bow. Naafiri was sealed into a deadly weapon. Other Darkin, including Zolani and many others whose names have been largely forgotten by the modern world, were also bound and contained. Each binding was an ordeal for those who had to perform it. The Darkin raged and screamed as they were imprisoned. They lashed out with all the power at their command, seeking to escape or to take their captors with them into oblivion. Many of those involved in the binding process were injured or killed in these encounters. Yet the Kinku Order and their allies persevered, driven by the knowledge that they were working to save all of Runeterra from eternal domination and suffering. When the majority of the Darkin had been bound and imprisoned, there remained only one matter left unresolved. Zaahen himself had to face judgment. The final confrontation of the Darkin Wars was not a battle against one of the corrupted god warriors, but rather a trial. Zaahen was brought before the Eye of Twilight at Koshin Peak, in the sacred temple of the Kinku Order. This was a moment of tremendous significance, for the Eye of Twilight was capable of seeing into the very heart and soul of any being that came before it. No deception was possible. No hidden corruption could be concealed. The judgment of the Eye of Twilight was final and absolute. Zaahen stood alone before the cosmic force, awaiting judgment. The Kinku Order and the assembled mortal warriors and allies looked on in silence, understanding that what was about to transpire would determine the fate not only of Zaahen, but potentially of all of Runeterra. Some feared that the Eye of Twilight would judge Zaahen as corrupted and require his imprisonment or destruction. Others had faith that the noble god warrior would be vindicated. What occurred in those final moments was not a judgment of condemnation. The Eye of Twilight, in its infinite wisdom and understanding, perceived that Zaahen had chosen a path different from that of his siblings. While all of the Darkin had been exposed to the same terrible knowledge and had faced the same temptations that led to their corruption, Zaahen had resisted those temptations at every turn. He had sacrificed his own reputation and his relationships with those who had once been his dearest companions in order to protect the innocent. He had chosen the difficult path of righteousness, rather than the alluring path of power and domination. The Eye of Twilight rendered its judgment. Zaahen had earned redemption. His actions had proven his worth. He would be allowed to go forth into the world unbound and unfettered. He would be granted the freedom to use his great power as he saw fit, with the understanding that he had demonstrated, through centuries of sacrifice, that he could be trusted to wield that power responsibly. Yet even as this judgment was delivered, something profound shifted in Zaahen's perception and understanding. He had resisted the corruption that had claimed his siblings, but he could feel within himself the same seeds of darkness, the same potential for corruption that had led them astray. He understood that though he had resisted so far, there was no guarantee that future ages would not bring circumstances or trials that might wear down his resistance. He knew that the longer his immortal life continued, the greater the chance that one day, despite his best intentions, he might fall prey to the very corruption that had destroyed his kind. And so, in an act of profound sacrifice and wisdom, Zaahen made a choice that no other being in all of Runeterra would have been capable of making. He stood before the Eye of Twilight and made a request that shocked all who heard it. Zaahen asked to be bound and imprisoned, just as his corrupted siblings had been bound and imprisoned. But unlike them, his imprisonment would not be for punishment. Rather, it would be an act of voluntary self-restraint, undertaken to protect the world from the potential that lay dormant within him. He could not guarantee that his noble nature would remain strong forever. He could not promise that the weight of centuries and the grinding wear of eternal existence would not eventually cause him to succumb to the same darkness that had claimed the others. And so, rather than risk bringing such catastrophe upon Runeterra, Zaahen asked to be sealed away, hidden in a place where he could neither threaten the world nor be tempted by the ambitions and conflicts of mortal peoples. The Eye of Twilight approved this request. The Kinku Order, with heavy hearts and profound respect for the sacrifice that Zaahen was making, set about preparing the binding ritual. But the binding that was prepared for Zaahen was different from those used to imprison the corrupted Darkin. Rather than being sealed into a weapon designed to be wielded in battle, Zaahen was bound into a sacred temple. The Temple of Twilight, as it came to be known, was a place of profound spiritual power, infused with protective wards and ancient magic that would ensure Zaahen remained securely sealed away. The Temple of Twilight was then taken out of the material world and placed into the spirit realm. The temple was shifted to a plane of existence that was adjacent to the normal world, but not fully part of it. This was accomplished through powerful ritual magic that combined the arcane knowledge of the Kinku Order with the last remaining power that Zaahen possessed as a free being. Once this ritual was complete, the Temple of Twilight existed in a sort of liminal space, separated from the normal world by barriers that could not easily be crossed. Part 4. The Vigil. To serve as the guardian and keeper of the Temple of Twilight, Zaahen asked that Yunara remain by his side. Though this meant that Yunara herself would be bound to the sacred temple and would be unable to leave it to walk freely in the world, she accepted this burden without hesitation. The woman who had been Zaahen's closest companion during the Great War against the Darkin agreed to maintain eternal vigil over the place where he was imprisoned. She agreed to dedicate the remainder of her life and however long the immortal existence granted to her by her proximity to the temple might extend, to ensuring that the seal that bound Zaahen remained secure and inviolable. And so Yunara became the eternal guardian of the Temple of Twilight. She took up residence within those sacred halls, walking the corridors and chambers that existed neither fully in the material world nor fully in the spirit realm. Her task was a solitary one in many ways, yet she never wavered in her commitment to it. She understood the importance of what she was protecting. She knew that the seal that bound Zaahen had been placed there not as a punishment, but as an act of supreme sacrifice on his part. She recognized that maintaining that seal was one of the most important duties that any being could possibly be assigned. For centuries, Yunara kept her vigil. The world beyond the Temple of Twilight continued to change and evolve. Kingdoms rose and fell. New peoples emerged in areas that had once been dominated by the Darkin. The age of overt dominion by god warriors faded into legend and myth. People began to forget the true history of the Darkin Wars and the role that Zaahen had played. In many places, the story of Yunara and Zaahen became distorted and transformed into legend and folklore. In the lands of Ionia, which had been one of the regions most directly affected by the conflicts between the Darkin and their enemies, a special legend grew up around the events of those ancient times. The story that eventually became prevalent among the Ionian people was one of a devoted shrine maiden who had chosen to follow a great spirit into voluntary exile as an act of penance and devotion. The tale became romanticized over the centuries, losing many of the harsh realities of the actual events while retaining the emotional core of sacrifice and devotion. In the Temple of Twilight, time moved differently than it did in the outside world. Yunara existed in a state of suspension that was not quite like ordinary life. Days could feel like hours, and hours could feel like days. The normal processes of aging and decay that claimed ordinary beings did not fully apply to her. She remained in a state of preserved vigor, neither growing older nor becoming younger, existing in a sort of timeless stasis that was both a blessing and a curse. Zaahen, sealed within the temple itself, existed in an even more profound state of dormancy. His consciousness had not been fully extinguished, but it was not active in the normal sense either. He existed in a sort of twilight awareness, not quite sleeping, yet not fully awake. It was a peculiar state of consciousness, one that allowed him to exist without either threatening the world or being tormented by the passage of time in the ordinary manner. Centuries passed in this state of suspension and vigil. Yunara maintained her post faithfully, walking the corridors of the temple, ensuring that the seals and wards remained intact, keeping alive the memory of the events that had transpired and the sacrifice that Zaahen had made. When she had the opportunity to interact with those from the outside world who managed to find their way to the spirit realm and the temple, she told them the true story. She explained the reality of the Darkin Wars, the nature of Zaahen's sacrifice, and the importance of maintaining his imprisonment. Not all who came to the temple understood or respected this mission. There were those who saw in Zaahen a potential tool or a source of power to be exploited. Some sought to convince Yunara to free him, offering promises of reward or threatening her if she did not comply. Yet Yunara remained steadfast. She had given her word to Zaahen, and she had no intention of breaking it. there was one figure in particular who became a concern during this long vigil. LeBlanc, a powerful sorceress and leader of a secret organization known as the Black Rose, had long been interested in the nature of the Darkin and the sources of their power. LeBlanc was not content to accept the official historical accounts of the Darkin Wars. She suspected that there was more to the story, that there were remnants of Darkin power and knowledge that had not been fully accounted for or destroyed in the aftermath of the conflicts. As LeBlanc pursued her investigations, she eventually came to learn of the existence of the Temple of Twilight and the seal that bound Zaahen. She began to formulate plans to breach the spirit realm and gain access to the temple. She understood that if she could release Zaahen, or at least gain access to the power that was imprisoned there, she could gain an enormous advantage in her various schemes and power struggles. LeBlanc began to work toward a complex plan to break the seal. She discovered that the boundaries between the material world and the spirit realm were not absolutely fixed. There were places where the boundaries grew thin, where it might be possible to breach the barriers with sufficient magical power and knowledge. She also learned that there were forces within the spirit realm itself that might be turned to her purposes. She discovered entities known as Azakana spirits, malevolent beings that existed in the spirit realm and could be manipulated through dark rituals and arcane compulsions. LeBlanc set her agents to work on implementing her plan. One aspect of this plan involved sending Azakana spirits into the material world to carry out various tasks and distractions. These spirits could be used to create chaos and confusion, to draw attention away from what was truly happening, and to weaken the defenses around the barrier between worlds. But LeBlanc was not working alone. She had allied herself with a powerful demon named Atakan, a being of immense strength and terrible hunger that had been bound into the form of a mortal warrior, but retained the essence and power of a true demon. Atakan served LeBlanc because it suited his purposes and because he recognized her power and cunning. Together, they began to make their moves toward breaking into the Temple of Twilight and releasing or capturing Zaahen. However, before their plans could fully come to fruition, something changed in the nature of reality itself. The barriers between the material world and the spirit realm, which had been stable and static for centuries, began to shift and move. The forces that had maintained the separation between these two realms, forces that had endured since the age of the Ascended, began to weaken and degrade. The cause of this change was complex and involved multiple factors. The death and resurrection of various champion figures, the conflicts between different factions seeking to control various regions and sources of power, the natural drift and decay of ancient magical structures that had been put in place ages ago without ongoing maintenance, and perhaps, as some scholars have speculated, changes in the nature of the Runeterra itself, shifts in the cosmic forces that govern the world and its various dimensions. Regardless of the exact cause, the result was that the Temple of Twilight, which had existed safely separated in the spirit realm for centuries, suddenly found itself pulled back into connection with the material world. The barriers that had kept it hidden and protected were breached. The temple began to manifest in the physical world, drawn forward by forces that even the Kinku order did not fully understand. Yunara, who had maintained her vigil faithfully for all those centuries, suddenly became aware that something was happening. The temple itself was changing. The seals and wards that she had so carefully maintained were beginning to destabilize. She recognized that the isolation that had protected both herself and Zaahen for all this time was coming to an end. Yunara immediately understood what must be done. She sent out a call for help, a spiritual summons that reached across the boundaries between worlds and called out to those who had reason to care about the fate of Zaahen and the integrity of his seal. She reached out through every channel of communication that was available to her, sending her message across Ionia and beyond. Part 5. The Breaking of Seals. The call of Yunara reached many ears, but there was one warrior in particular who heard it and understood its importance. His name was Xinjiao, and he was the leader and representative of the Dalmatian people, a civilization that had emerged in the regions where the ancient Ascended once ruled. Xinjiao was himself a warrior of tremendous skill and capability. He had heard the legends of Zaahen and understood, from his studies of history, the true nature of what the ancient god-warrior had done. He recognized that if the seal that bound Zaahen was truly breaking, then steps must be taken to either reinforce that seal or to ensure that if Zaahen was released, his emergence into the world would not lead to catastrophe. Xinjiao gathered his most trusted warriors and companions. He prepared for a journey to the First Lands, to the location where the Temple of Twilight was beginning to manifest in the physical world. The journey was perilous and fraught with danger, for the changes occurring at the boundary between worlds were creating unstable and dangerous conditions in many places. As Xinjiao and his companions traveled toward their destination, they began to encounter various obstacles and challenges. These obstacles had been deliberately placed by LeBlanc and Atakan, who had their own plans for what was about to transpire. Yet Xinjiao and his companions persevered through these challenges, demonstrating the same courage and determination that was expected of a true Dalmatian warrior. At certain sacred locations along the route, Xinjiao and his companions encountered what were known as the Trials of Twilight. These were tests that had been put in place long ago by the Kinku Order and the Eye of Twilight itself. These trials were designed to test the character, courage, and worthiness of those who would seek to approach the Temple of Twilight and become involved in the fate of Zaahen. Each trial was designed to test different aspects of a warrior or person. Some trials tested physical strength and combat prowess. Others tested wisdom and judgment. Still others tested moral character and the ability to resist temptation. Xinjiao faced each of these trials with determination and managed to overcome them. Though the experience was grueling and at times he came close to failure, his fundamental strength of character and his genuine commitment to the righteous cause allowed him to persevere. As Xinjiao moved through the trials, he heard voices. Some of these voices seemed to come from the temple itself, from Zaahen, reaching out from his sealed prison to communicate with those who approached. The voice warned Xinjiao away from certain paths and certain choices that would lead to disaster. Yet other voices seemed to come from different sources, and Xinjiao had to rely on his judgment to determine which guidance to follow and which to reject. Meanwhile, at the Temple of Twilight itself, Yunara prepared for the final confrontation that she knew was coming. She had maintained her vigil for centuries, and now that vigil was about to be tested as never before. She knew that LeBlanc and her allies would soon arrive, that they would attempt to breach the temple and seize whatever power they could find there. She also knew that Xinjiao was on his way, and she hoped that he would arrive in time to aid in the defense. When LeBlanc and Atakan finally arrived at the temple, they came with tremendous power and determination. Atakan had been enhanced and strengthened through dark rituals and fusions with various demonic powers. He was a being of immense size and strength, more akin to a natural disaster than to any ordinary warrior. LeBlanc had brought with her magical knowledge and artifacts of great power accumulated over centuries of study and scheming. Yunara confronted them at the threshold of the temple. Though she was still powerful, granted strength by her centuries of existence in proximity to the spiritual forces of the temple, she was alone and her enemies were numerous. The initial confrontation seemed destined to end in her defeat and the breach of the temple seal. But even as the situation appeared to be growing desperate, Xinjiao arrived. He had emerged from the trials of twilight and proceeded directly to the temple, arriving just in time to join Yunara in the defense against the forces that sought to break the seal. The two of them, warrior and eternal guardian, stood together against the combined might of LeBlanc and Atakan. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate. Xinjiao fought with all the skill and courage that was expected of a great Damasian warrior. His spear moved like water, flowing and adapting to the movements of his enemies. His techniques, honed through years of training and combat, proved to be effective against the corrupted power that Atakan wielded. Yet even Xinjiao, skilled as he was, found himself gradually being driven back by the raw power that Atakan could bring to bear. It became clear that Xinjiao and Yunara could not defeat Atakan through direct combat. The demon was simply too powerful, too resilient. With each blow that Xinjiao landed, Atakan seemed to recover almost immediately. With each spell that Yunara cast, Atakan seemed to find a way to circumvent or counter it. It was at this moment of crisis, when all seemed to be lost, that a change occurred. The temple itself, responding to the desperation of the situation and the breaking of the seals that had bound Zaahen for so long, began to release him. The long hibernation in which Zaahen had been kept was coming to an end. The barriers that had held him in stasis were deteriorating rapidly. Zaahen began to awaken. His consciousness, which had been dormant for so long, began to stir and return to awareness. It was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent and traumatic process, as the mind that had been suspended in twilight consciousness struggled to return to full awareness after so many centuries of enforced sleep. In the final moment before Xinjiao would have been overwhelmed, before Atakan would have succeeded in completely breaching the temple seal, Zaahen made a choice. Perhaps it was instinct born from his long dedication to the protection of others. Perhaps it was some fragment of communication that reached him through the breaking seals and the failing barriers. Perhaps it was something else entirely. But whatever the reason, Zaahen chose not to remain sealed. Zaahen chose to merge with Xinjiao. This was not a victory in the traditional sense, nor was it a complete release of Zaahen from his self-imposed confinement. Rather, it was something new and unprecedented. In a moment of supreme sacrifice and profound spiritual communion, Zaahen's essence bonded with Xinjiao, the great god warrior, the noble ascended who had chosen to imprison himself rather than risk bringing corruption to the world, fused his power and his consciousness with that of the Damasian warrior. Xinjiao felt the weight and power of the immortal being settling into his form. He felt the knowledge and the centuries of experience of Zaahen becoming part of his consciousness. He understood in that moment what it meant to be touched by the divine, to have the strength and wisdom of a god warrior flowing through his mortal form. Together, as a unified being combining the immortal power of Zaahen with the mortal vitality and skill of Xinjiao, they turned to face Atakan. The demon, caught off guard by this unexpected development, found himself suddenly facing an opponent of much greater power than he had anticipated. The combined strength of god warrior and mortal champion proved to be more than Atakan could withstand. With a single strike of tremendous power, Xinjiao, wielding the unified might of both himself and Zaahen, drove the demon away. Atakan, overwhelmed by the power arrayed against him, was destroyed in the encounter. The demon, which had been strengthened through dark rituals and had seemed so invincible, was utterly obliterated by the force of that combined strike. With Atakan destroyed, LeBlanc found herself facing an enemy far more formidable than she had anticipated. She recognized that her plans had come to naught. The seal she had sought to break had not been broken in the way that she had intended. The power that she had sought to harness was no longer something that she could control or wield. She made the decision to retreat, to gather her forces and consider her next move from a position of safety and security. Yet, even as LeBlanc fled, she was not entirely defeated. She had learned valuable information about the nature of darkened power and the mechanisms by which they could be contained or released. She understood that there were other aspects of this story that remained to be uncovered, other players in the great game of power and dominion that was being played out across Runeterra. Part 6. A new beginning. The immediate crisis had passed, but the transformation that had occurred was permanent. Xinjiao was no longer simply a Damasian warrior. He had become something more. He had become the vessel for Zaahen, the chosen form through which the noble god warrior would once again walk the world. For Zaahen, this was a strange and somewhat terrible awakening. He had prepared himself centuries ago to accept isolation and confinement in order to protect the world from the corruption that he feared lay dormant within him. He had made peace with the idea that he would never again walk freely in the world, never again use his full power openly. He had accepted that his greatest act of service would be one of restraint and self-limitation. Yet now he found himself thrust back into the world, merged with a mortal warrior, no longer able to return to the sealed temple, no longer able to hide away from the temptations and conflicts that characterize the affairs of the world. It was almost like a second loss of innocence, a second moment of terrible change in a life that had already endured so very much change and tragedy. Yet there was also something positive in this development. Xinjiao, despite being a mortal and thus limited in lifespan compared to an immortal being, proved to be a worthy host. His character was strong and virtuous. His commitment to justice and the protection of the innocent was as great as Zaahen could have asked for. And perhaps most importantly, the merger between the two beings was not one of domination or subjugation. Rather, It was a partnership, a communion of spirit. Xinjiao and Zaahen coexisted within the unified form that they had become. They retained their individual senses of self and their individual perspectives, yet they could also access each other's knowledge, experience and power. Xinjiao could draw upon the centuries of wisdom and martial skill that Zaahen possessed. Zaahen could understand the vitality and immediate engagement with the world that characterized Xinjiao's mortal existence. Together, they formed something more powerful and more complete than either could be alone. Yunara, who had maintained her vigil in the Temple of Twilight for so long, found herself facing a new situation. The temple, torn from its isolation in the spirit realm and brought into connection with the material world, was no longer in need of a guardian in quite the same way that it had been before. The seal that she had guarded so faithfully had been broken, not by her enemies, but by Zaahen himself, in an act of ultimate sacrifice and wisdom. Yet Yunara's duty was not entirely ended. She recognized that she was still bound to Zaahen, still connected to his fate and his destiny. She understood that she had a role to play in the world that was now unfolding. And so, she stepped out of the temple for the first time in centuries, walking once more upon the world that had changed so much during her long vigil. The reunion between Yunara and Zaahen was profound and deeply moving. Though Zaahen's essence was now merged with Xinjiao, and though Zaahen's appearance had changed through this transformation, Yunara recognized him. She understood that the noble being she had served for so long was still present, still vital, still committed to the cause of protecting the world and upholding the principles of honor and justice. Part 7. The World Awakens word of what had transpired at the Temple of Twilight spread rapidly through the lands. The emergence of Zaahen, after centuries of sealed imprisonment, was an event of tremendous significance. Many people had thought the age of the god warriors to be completely past, relegated to legend and myth. The revelation that one of the great ascended warriors of ancient times had survived, had maintained his noble nature despite all temptation, and had now emerged into the world again, sent waves of reaction and response rippling through all the kingdoms and regions of Runeterra. Some hailed Zaahen as a champion and a savior. They saw in him proof that the ancient virtues of honor, sacrifice, and steadfast commitment to righteousness could endure even across the vastness of ages. They viewed his return to the world as a sign that hope was not lost, that the forces of corruption and darkness could be resisted and overcome. Others responded with fear. The very idea that a being of such power had emerged from sealed imprisonment was terrifying to those who valued security and the established order of things. Some kingdoms mobilized their military forces, preparing for a potential threat. Some sent ambassadors and negotiators, seeking to understand what Zaahen intended and whether his intentions were genuinely peaceful. In the regions of Ionia, the emergence of Zaahen was particularly significant. The people of Ionia had long remembered the legend of the devoted shrine maiden Yunara, though the true history of that legend had been largely forgotten. Now, with Yunara appearing openly in the world once more, the people began to re-examine the old stories and to piece together the true history of the ancient conflicts and the sacred sacrifice that had been made. The Kinku order, which had maintained its existence through the long centuries that had passed, was deeply affected by the return of Zaahen. The leaders of the Kinku recognized that the age that they had been living through, the age of sealed imprisonment and careful guardianship, was coming to an end. A new age was beginning, an age in which the old threats might re-emerge and new challenges would certainly arise. The implications of Zaahen's return extended far beyond Ionia. Across all of Runeterra, from the sun-baked deserts of Shurima, to the snow-covered mountains of the Freljord, to the metallic cities of Zun and Piltover, the emergence of the god warrior was recognized as a significant event. In Demacia, the order that valued law and rigid structure above all else, the appearance of Zaahen created both hope and concern. Demacia had been founded partly in opposition to the tyranny of the ancient god warriors and the Darkin that they had become. Yet Demacia also recognized that Zaahen represented something different from the corruption and domination that had characterized the Darkin Wars. He represented the possibility of power wielded responsibly, of strength dedicated to the protection of the weak. In Noxus, the empire that valued strength and conquest above all else, the emergence of Zaahen was recognized as a challenge. Noxus had built its power on the strength of its warriors and its willingness to use force to achieve its goals. The idea that there existed a being of such tremendous power, who was dedicated not to conquest, but to protection and justice, represented a threat to Noxian ideals and a challenge to their assumptions about the nature of strength and power. Part 8. The Internal Struggle. Yet even as the world responded to Zaahen's return, Zaahen himself was facing a profound internal struggle. The very fear that he had sought to protect himself and the world from through his self-imposed imprisonment was becoming relevant once more. Having been sealed away for so long, separated from the active conflicts and challenges of the world, Zaahen now found himself thrust back into situations that required the use of his power, that demanded engagement with the complexities and ambiguities of the world. With each use of his power, with each decision to act forcefully or dramatically, Zaahen worried. He wondered if he was gradually being drawn down the same path that had claimed so many of his siblings. He questioned whether the noble intentions that guided his choices were beginning to be corrupted by the temptations of power that he wielded. He feared that even now, even in his new form merged with Xinjiao, the corruption that he had resisted for so long might find a way to take hold of him. This internal struggle was one that Zaahen could not entirely share with others, even with Yunara or Xinjiao. It was deeply personal, rooted in his own experience and his own understanding of the forces that had corrupted his siblings. Yet it also influenced many of the choices and decisions that he made as he re-engaged with the world and with the conflicts that characterized it. Zaahen's approach to dealing with the various crises and challenges that he encountered reflected this internal struggle. He did not seek power for its own sake. He did not engage in conquest or domination. He tried to use his abilities in ways that minimized harm and that served the cause of protecting the innocent. Yet he also recognized that complete abstention from using his power was itself a form of weakness, a refusal of responsibility. And so he walked a careful path, trying to use his strength in service of justice without allowing that strength to become corrupted by the very pride that it could engender. Xinjiao, as Zaahen's host and partner, became crucial to Zaahen's ability to navigate this internal struggle. The Damazian warrior's connection to the world, his immediate and visceral understanding of mortal concerns and values, helped keep Zaahen grounded. When Zaahen was tempted to see the world through the lens of power and dominion, Xinjiao was there to remind him of the human cost of such perspectives. When Zaahen was tempted to withdraw from active engagement with the world due to fear of corruption, Xinjiao was there to argue for the necessity of action and responsibility. Similarly, Zaahen's wisdom and experience, accumulated over centuries of existence and observation, provided a counterbalance to Xinjiao's more immediate and passionate perspectives. When Xinjiao was tempted to act with haste or without sufficient consideration for long-term consequences, Zaahen was there to encourage patience and strategic thinking. The two of them, working together, were able to navigate the complexities of this new situation in ways that neither could have achieved alone. Part 9. The old threats return. As time passed and Zaahen adjusted to his new form of existence, new and troubling developments began to emerge. The weakening of the barriers between the material world and the spirit realm that had enabled Zaahen's release from the Temple of Twilight had not been a simple, isolated event. Rather, it was symptomatic of larger changes occurring in the fundamental structure of Runeterra itself. Other Darkin, imprisoned in their various weapons and artifacts centuries ago, began to stir as well. The bindings that held them were experiencing similar weakening effects. In some cases, the seals that had held them began to break down entirely. The nightmare scenario that Zaahen had sought to prevent through his own self-imprisonment was beginning to unfold. The Darkin were awakening. Aatrox, imprisoned in his sword and buried in unknown depths, began to move and to exert his will once more. Varus, bound in his bow and hidden away for ages, felt the bonds that held him beginning to loosen. Other Darkin, their names largely forgotten by the modern world, but their power undiminished, similarly began to awaken. This presented a tremendous challenge, not only to Zaahen, but to all of Runeterra. The Darkin Wars were thought to be a thing of the past, a conflict that belonged to ancient history. No one had been prepared for the possibility that they might have to face the threat of awakening Darkin in the modern age. Yet Zaahen understood the gravity of what was happening. He recognized that he had a responsibility that went beyond his own fear of corruption. He recognized that if he did not act, if he did not use his power and his knowledge to try to contain the awakening Darkin and protect the world from their depredations, then countless innocents would suffer. He could not hide away in self-imposed exile, leaving others to face a threat that only he truly understood. And so, Zaahen began to pursue the awakening Darkin, working with Yunara, with Xinjiao, and with allies and champions from across Runeterra who understood the gravity of the situation. Zaahen set about tracking down and dealing with the threats posed by the returning god warriors of darkness. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was not a conflict between kingdoms or nations seeking territorial advantage. Rather, it was a desperate and ongoing struggle to contain and manage threats that could potentially overwhelm all of civilization if they were left unchecked. It was a conflict that demanded wisdom and strategy as much as it demanded power and strength. In the course of this struggle, Zaahen was forced to make some of the most difficult choices of his existence. There were moments when he had to choose between letting his siblings remain free and risking chaos, or imprisoning them once more, knowing that each imprisonment caused them suffering, and knowing that imprisoning them meant taking responsibility for their confinement indefinitely. There were moments when he had to balance his desire to avoid becoming like the Darkin he opposed with the necessity of using tremendous power to protect the world. Throughout all of this, the question of Zaahen's own nature remained unsettled. He was neither fully the sealed and imprisoned god warrior he had chosen to be, nor was he one of the corrupted Darkin that had brought so much suffering to the world. He existed in a liminal space, defining himself through his choices and his commitments, rather than through his nature alone. Part 10. The Eternal Vigil. As the narrative of Zaahen's emergence into the modern world continued, the meaning of his return gradually became clear. Zaahen had not returned to the world to bring about some grand transformation or to reshape civilization according to his will. Rather, he had returned because the world needed him, because the threats that he understood better than any other being required his knowledge and his power to be contained. In a very real sense, Zaahen's return was not an ending of his vigil, but a transformation of it. Where once he had maintained his vigil through self-imposed imprisonment, accepting the isolation and the suspension of his consciousness as a necessary sacrifice to prevent corruption, he now maintained his vigil through active engagement with the world. He watched over the lands of Runeterra, tracking the threats posed by awakening Darkin, by ambitious sorcerers like LeBlanc, who sought to exploit the chaos, and by other forces of darkness that emerged in the wake of the disruption to the barriers between worlds. The prophecy that had guided Zaahen in ages past took on new meaning in this context. The words that had been spoken long ago, that seemed to define his purpose and his destiny were, "Steel the mind, temper the flesh, and hunt the fallen." In his sealed imprisonment, Zaahen had focused on steeling his mind against corruption and tempering his flesh through discipline and restraint. Now, in his renewed engagement with the world, he understood that the third part of the prophecy was equally important. He would hunt the fallen. He would pursue his corrupted siblings and others who had turned away from the light. He would work to contain and manage the threats that they represented. Yet even in this new understanding of his purpose, Zaahen remained fundamentally true to the principles that had guided him throughout his existence. He did not seek to destroy the Darkin out of hatred or vengeance. He sought to contain them out of compassion and responsibility. He understood that they were not purely evil beings, but rather victims of corruption, noble warriors whose minds and spirits had been twisted by exposure to terrible knowledge and terrible power. This understanding guided Zaahen in his interactions with other awakening Darkin and with other heroes and champions of Runeterra who sought to deal with the same threats. He counseled restraint and caution. He advocated for solutions that would minimize suffering while still protecting the innocent. He worked to educate others about the true nature of the Darkin and the circumstances that had led to their corruption, hoping that such understanding would lead to more compassionate and effective responses to the crises that arose. Part 11. The continuation. And so the story of Zaahen continues beyond the moment of his emergence from the Temple of Twilight. It is a story that is still being written in many ways. For though Zaahen has been awakened from his long imprisonment and has emerged into the modern world, the conflicts and challenges that characterized his existence in ancient times have not been entirely resolved. The Darkin continue to awaken. The barriers between worlds continue to shift and change. The forces of ambition and corruption continue to seek ways to exploit the chaos and disruption that has resulted from these events. And through it all, Zaahen continues to fulfill his purpose, continues to maintain his vigil over the lands of Runeterra, continues to walk the difficult path between the temptations of power and the necessity of action. Yunara, no longer bound to a single temple, but still devoted to the cause that has defined her existence for centuries, continues to stand at Zaahen's side. She has become a bridge between the ancient world of the god warriors and the modern world of mortal kingdoms and heroes. She helps Zaahen understand the ways in which the world has changed during his long slumber, and she helps others understand the true history and meaning of the ancient conflicts. Xinjiao, the Damasian warrior who has become the host and partner of the god warrior, continues to learn and grow in the role that he has been thrust into. He represents the possibility of cooperation and partnership between mortal and immortal, between the immediate engagement with the world that characterizes human existence and the vast perspective that comes with immortal years of experience. The eye of twilight continues to watch, to judge, and to maintain its cosmic perspective on the events unfolding in the material world. The Kinku order continues to work to maintain the balance between the material world and the spirit realm, to keep the barriers between worlds in a state that allows neither complete separation nor unwanted intrusion. Part 12. The meaning of sacrifice. In many ways, Zaahen's story is a story about the meaning of sacrifice. It is a story about a being of immense power choosing to constrain that power, choosing to accept limitation and loss in order to protect others. It is a story about the willingness to surrender personal freedom and personal desire in service of a greater good. Zaahen sacrificed his freedom when he chose to seal himself away in the Temple of Twilight. He sacrificed his individual existence and his separate identity when he merged with Xinjiao. Yet in each case, these sacrifices were not made out of weakness or despair. Rather, they were made out of a deep understanding of the nature of power and the responsibilities that come with wielding such power. Yunara sacrificed her ability to walk freely in the world when she agreed to serve as the eternal guardian of the Temple of Twilight. She sacrificed centuries of her life to the maintenance of a vigil that others might have found unbearable. Yet she did so not with bitterness, but with a clear understanding of the importance of the duty she had undertaken. Xinjiao sacrificed his normal human existence when he became the host of Zaahen. He can no longer be solely a Damasian warrior, devoted entirely to the service of his people and his kingdom. Rather, he has become something more, a vessel for an immortal consciousness, burdened with the knowledge and the concerns of a being who has seen centuries pass and who carries the weight of ancient conflicts and ancient responsibilities. Each of these sacrifices represents a different kind of loss, yet each of them also represents a kind of gain. Zaahen, by surrendering his freedom, secured the continuation of his existence and the preservation of the principles that he valued. Yunara, by maintaining her vigil, preserved the seal that protected the world from Zaahen potential corruption, and helped maintain the continuity of history and memory across the ages. Xinjiao, by becoming Zaahen's host, gained access to power and wisdom that no ordinary mortal could ever possess, and became a part of something greater than himself. The story of Zaahen is thus also a story about the nobility of sacrifice, about the ways in which giving up something valuable can result in something even more valuable being preserved or achieved. It is a story that suggests that true strength is sometimes found not in the assertion of will or the pursuit of personal desires, but in the willingness to set aside personal desires in service of a greater good. Part 13. The Internal Resolution. As Zaahen settled into his new form of existence, as he learned to balance the power that he wielded with the restraint that he sought to maintain, he gradually came to a form of internal resolution regarding his fear of corruption. Zaahen came to understand that the corruption that had claimed his siblings was not inevitable, was not simply a consequence of the power that they possessed. Rather, it had come about through specific choices and specific circumstances. Aatrox and the others had pursued blood magic not because they had to, but because they chose to. They had allowed the trauma of their experiences to overwhelm them and to guide their decisions, not because they could not resist that impulse, but because they chose not to resist it. Zaahen understood that by remaining vigilant, by choosing again and again to use his power in service of justice and protection, rather than in service of ambition and domination, he could maintain his own integrity and prevent his own corruption. The fear that he carried was legitimate and important, a guardian against the kind of complacency that had allowed his siblings to fall. But that fear need not be paralyzing. It could instead be a source of strength, a constant reminder of the vigilance that maintaining one's own integrity required. In merging with Xinjiao, Zaahen found a partner who could help him maintain that vigilance. Xinjiao was not merely a host or a vessel. He was a collaborator, a being whose distinct perspective and whose connection to the immediate concerns and values of mortal peoples could provide a counterbalance to Zaahen's more distant and cosmic perspective. Part 14. The Promise of the Future. The story of Zaahen as it stands at this moment in time is one that remains open to the future. The Darkin Wars may not be entirely in the past. The threats posed by awakening god warriors and ambitious sorcerers like LeBlanc continue to develop and evolve. The barriers between the material world and the spirit realm may continue to shift and change, creating new challenges and new opportunities. Yet Zaahen faces all of this with a determination that is grounded in centuries of experience and hardened by the trials and sacrifices he has already endured. He faces these challenges not as the sealed and isolated god warrior of the Temple of Twilight, but as a being who has chosen to remain engaged with the world, who has accepted responsibility for his own nature and the power that he wields, and who continues to believe that the principles of honor, justice, and protection of the innocent are worth fighting for. The prophecy that guides him speaks of hunting the fallen. This is the task that Zaahen has undertaken. This is the purpose that drives him forward. And though the path ahead is uncertain and filled with dangers, Zaahen walks it with the knowledge that he does not walk alone. He has Yunara at his side, devoted companion of centuries. He has Xinjiao as his partner and host, a mortal warrior whose strength and commitment match his own. He has allies and friends across Runeterra who understand the gravity of what is at stake and who are willing to fight alongside him. Epilogue. The eternal vigil continues, and so, as the night deepens, as the stars grow brighter in the sky above Runeterra, Zaahen continues his eternal vigil. The Temple of Twilight, though no longer his prison, stands as a monument to the sacrifice he made. Yunara, though no longer bound to a single place, continues to serve the cause that has defined her existence. Xinjiao, though no longer entirely himself, exists as a living example of the possibility of cooperation and partnership between mortal and immortal. The world sleeps, and in that sleep, people dream of heroes and legends, of ancient powers and eternal struggles between light and darkness. They dream of a noble god warrior who chose sacrifice over power, who chose restraint over domination, who chose to protect the weak even at great cost to himself. The story of Zaahen, the Unsundered, the blade between the Ascended and the Darkin, the one who hunts the fallen while resisting the corruption that threatens to consume him, is a story that will be told and retold. It is a story that speaks to something deep within the hearts of those who hear it, something that recognizes the nobility of sacrifice and the power of commitment to principles higher than oneself. And in the Temple of Twilight, even now, though Zaahen no longer rests there, though the seal has been broken and the vigil transformed, the Eye of Twilight continues its eternal watch. It observes the choices that are being made, the paths that are being followed, the consequences of actions both great and small. It maintains its cosmic perspective on the unfolding events of Runeterra, ready to pass judgment if needed, ready to guide those who seek guidance. The night is long, and sleep is gentle, and in the peace of slumber, the great struggles and conflicts of the waking world seem far away. Yet they continue, nonetheless. Zaahen continues his hunt. Yunara continues her vigil. Xinjiao continues to exist as the bridge between worlds. And the story continues ever onward, moving toward conclusions that cannot yet be foreseen, and toward challenges that cannot yet be imagined. Sleep now, knowing that there are those who keep watch. Sleep knowing that even as darkness gathers in some corners of the world, there are beings of power and principle who stand against it. Sleep knowing that sacrifice and nobility and the commitment to doing what is right, even when that right comes at great cost, are not merely fantasies of stories and legends, but realities that exist in the world, even if they are not always visible to those who sleep. The story of Zaahen, the noble god warrior who walks between the light and the shadow, continues on. And in that continuation, in the unfolding of events yet to come, perhaps there is hope. Perhaps there is a reminder that the fight for what is right is never truly ended, but must be sustained across generations and across ages. Perhaps there is a testimony to the enduring power of honor, sacrifice, and the commitment to protecting the innocent. And as the final words of this tale are spoken, and as sleep finally comes to claim those who have heard them, the stars wheel in their eternal dance above the lands of Runeterra. Zaahen looks up at those stars, seeing in them the memory of what once was and the possibility of what might yet come to be. And somewhere in the depths of the Temple of Twilight, the Eye of Twilight watches and waits, eternal and unchanging, a silent witness to the unfolding of destiny.